Hey guys, this is Jeff from Reference Analog out in Oklahoma. So today we're going to be looking at the Rel number 31 subwoofer. So this sub is a serious contender in the high-end audio world, and today we're going to be getting a hands-on and taking a look at its design, its tech specs, and more importantly, how it sounds. So we're going to get started with the design. So as you can see, we've got like some nice sleek curves and lines and stuff in the rail cabinetry, and this is kind of meant to resemble kind of the runabouts of like older boat design and stuff, where they're the wood runabouts and whatnot, the Chris Craft kind of boats. So it's got that real sleek look to it. We've also got the badging on top, which is actually meant to help dampen the top plate of the subwoofer. This one has got carbon fiber in it, which is to make it kind of match the carbon fiber driver. As we come around, we have a couple handles on the sides, which come in handy when you're trying to manipulate this sub. I probably wouldn't suggest picking it up from the handles. They are stiff and can support the weight of the sub, but they are also attached with I believe like wood screws, so I probably wouldn't use them as the primary source of how you pick it up. Get a buddy, he'll want to see the sub anyway. So as we come around here, we look at different elements as far as the drivers. So Rels use in the 31s a carbon fiber driver. This is a 12-inch driver, and with this 12-inch long throw carbon fiber driver, the weight of it and the stiffness of it are what allows Rel to use a 900 watt amplifier. I get a lot of people who ask me like, oh man, it's only 900 watts, I can get a 2500 watt amp from XYZ brand, right? And the difference is the weight and the stiffness of the drivers. So these drivers can be controlled and move far faster and far linearly with a 900 watt driver or 900 watt amplifier than a big heavy like home theater type sub with a 2500 watt amp. So part of the design elements and the specs and kind of things actually match the driver to the amplifier. It's not just a matter of like how many watts can we throw at it. So speaking of the amp, this is a 900 watt Class D amplifier, and I'll spin this around and you guys can kind of see it as I spin it here. But also, I'll spin it around and look at this amp. So in this amplifier, pick it up here. Oh, and by the way, this sub is about 112 pounds, I believe, somewhere right in there. So we've got the IEC connection. We have a LFE output and an XLR output. So those are going to be if you're going to do, jump to multiple subs in a chain. And then we've got the XLR left input and the XLR right input, and then the RCA versions of those. So depending on your situation, you can use those connections. And then up here we've got the 0.1 or LFE inputs. So, but below is the part that I feel like makes Rel somewhat unique in how great they sound. So these are the high level connections. And so a high level connection actually connects directly to your amplifier or your speaker terminals. And you're going to be using the high level input. All right. So on the input, that's the one that you're actually getting the signal through. They also have a high level output, which is meant to stack Rels and do a line array of 31s. So we would have potentially 6 31s here. And when you do a line array, then you jump from sub to sub to get the signal to the other two, which is why there's an in and an out on those. To talk a little bit about the high level input. So a lot of people get very confused about the high level input factor, and the high level input at its most basic is basically meant to capture the true signal that is coming to your speakers. So when we're trying to blend the sound of the sub with the mains, we want it to be seamless and completely disappear. And the best way to do that is get as much character from the system itself into the sub as we can. So it's speaking in the same tone, in the same texture, in the same, way that our mains are getting their signal. So when we tap the amplifier terminals and get the actual signal from the amp to the sub, then it's getting the same signal as our speakers are getting. With this, there's also a lot of confusion on connections, right? So you've got all these different amplifier topologies. You've got Class A, Class AB, Class D, and you've even got some oddballs, which that are out there. And so anyway, the easiest thing to keep in mind is that the black wire is searching for ground, and the yellow and red wires from the connection are your signal. So they need the actual signal. With dual differential amplifiers and things like that, the negative terminal is not a true negative. It's more like an inverse hot. So I'm not an amplifier designer or builder or anything like that. So if I mess something up here, give me a little bit of grace. But the deal is that we don't want a hot signal coming down our black line. And so, because our black line is actually ground. So we want to keep our black from getting a hot signal. So an easy thing to ask an amplifier maker, if you have an amp and you're planning to get one of these subs, is call the manufacturer and ask them, is your negative terminal ground or is it an inversed hot, or a hot line? And they will be able to tell you, oh, that's ground. And on audio researches, interestingly enough, the 4 ohm positive is actually where ground lies. And so with a audio research, you actually connect your yellow and red to positive 8 ohm, and you connect your black to positive 4 ohm. So it's pretty counterintuitive with audio research, but all other brands, you're going to be doing that arrangement. With like Boulder, for instance, Boulder amplifiers, you cannot connect the black wire to your negative terminal because you will be getting, voltage to the sub. So the easiest way, if you're in doubt, is only connect the red and yellow wires and leave your black hanging. And if you get hum in your subs, then you're going to have to get ground. And so then see about a terminal, a screw, chassis screw, or if your amplifier has a ground, connection, then hook to that ground connection. Otherwise, search for a chassis screw or something along those lines, which will then in turn give you ground. So you never want to hook up your black to one of the black terminals on an amplifier like the Boulder. So the easiest way that I go in as a dealer with almost all amps is I don't connect the black. And so I connect the yellow and the red, and then I leave black hanging. And then if I get hum, I find a ground or a chassis screw, which is going to provide me ground. That is going to be uniformly the easiest way to do that and be able to never have a chance of messing that up. So when you're using a pair of subs, then each sub is going to have its high level cable from Rel, and they include the high level cable. So each cable, as we've kind of discussed here, has a black, yellow, and red. So when you're doing mono, you're going to just tie your you're going to tie your yellow and red together, and that's going to be your positive for just your, let's say, left channel. So you're going to connect that yellow and red to your positive terminal of your amplifier or your speaker. A lot of people don't realize you can do it to the speaker. You can. And that is going to establish your left channel. The only difficulty about doing it to the speaker is that if you do need ground, you're going to have to find ground somewhere there, right? And generally your speaker is not necessarily grounded. So going back to the amplifier is the surefire way that you're going to be able to find something there to ground to if needed. With the 31s, I rarely have an issue with hum, and so normally I don't connect the ground wire to anything. But all amps are different. And I know with like Krells, I've had, a lot of Krells that I've hooked up to, and you almost always have to find a chassis screw with a Grell, you know, because it's gonna hum like crazy if you don't. So with the other side of the room here, so we've established the left channel, and you just twist the yellow and the red together and you connect it to your left channel's positive terminal and leave your black hanging. On your right channel, you do the exact same, only to the right channel. So that's with a mono configuration. With a stereo configuration, where you've only, I mean mono by meaning that there's one per each channel. If you're running the sub in stereo, then the sub is basically going to have to get the signal from both channels because you've only got one sub now. And when you do that, then you take your red wire and you connect it to your right channel positive of your amplifier, and you take your yellow wire and you connect it to the left channel of your amplifier's positive. So that way the sub is now getting signal from both channels. So when you're using high level, you're going to want to make sure to do that on a stereo, you know, on a single sub, you know, situation. The other element is like you still don't connect the ground, you know, the black wire, unless you're positive that your black terminal is indeed ground, and then go ahead and connect it that way. Otherwise, if you're not unsure, like I said, just leave it hanging and see what happens. In worst case scenario, you're going to get some hum coming out of the sub, and it's going to be pretty loud. And just, you know, unhook the connection, and you're good. That hum will stop, and then you can go find ground and not be stressed that your sub is humming away. So anyway, let's talk about performance of these guys. So performance is the whole reason why I carry Rel, and the whole reason why most people own Rels. The performance of a Rel is unlike any other sub. And so when I have a customer talking to me about subwoofers, I personally don't really do home theater. We're pretty much a 2-channel store. We specialize in 2-channel equipment. And so I generally tell them, if you're only familiar with a home theater sub, then the Rel is going to rock your world in a good way and possibly confuse you in another way, right? So most people who are used to a home theater subwoofer are used to this big bang and boom and loose kind of performance. And so it rattles the walls and you can hear it and it shakes the room and it's this big explosion of power, right? But it's very in your face and it does not blend with what is happening. It's more an LFE type situation where you've got a sub and you want to hear it, by golly. And in a 2-channel arrangement, that is absolutely never what you want. In a 2-channel arrangement, you're generally wanting it to blend and get out of the way, and you're wanting it to extend the capabilities of your speakers. And in Rel fashion, it also tends to open up the top end and open up the soundstage a little bit. So it actually affects more than just the bass, which is kind of crazy. And but you know, it absolutely does. And so with a Rel, the key is that you're wanting to blend it to the point that you can't tell it's there until you unplug it. And once you unplug it, you go, oh my gosh, it was doing so much for my system. And then you plug it back in and go, oh, there it was, or there it is, okay. You know, and so the goal is for it to disappear unless you get rid of it. And then when you unplug it, you go, wow, you know. And so that's how well that a Rel should blend, and that's where you should take a Rel when you get it. And that's their intention with Rel. So the Rel subwoofers for like this specific sub, you know, you can use it in a home theater environment, but it's going to perform very differently than what you're used to with a quintessential home theater subwoofer. Rel came out with a few years ago the HT series subwoofers, which maintain some of the speed of like these kind of subs, but also have a little bit more home theater type sound to appease like the home theater crowd. So if you're looking for a home theater sub that you want better, you know, performance, you want it to be tighter, then they've got, you know, subs like the Predator out there that are going to be awesome. In a 2-channel environment, this is what we're looking for. We're looking for that tight speed that's going to keep up with our, you know, high-end home 2-channel setups. So when Implementing a rel. Let's talk about that just a minute, because I think implementation is what I was just discussing, right? So that's the performance of what the rel is capable of, but to unlock that capability really takes a keen ear and takes you really spending some time with it. The rel subs are not one of those where you run a room correction and you just sit back and let the computer go beep beep bop bop, and then at the end of it you've got this great performance, right? Rel, you kind of dial in by ear, and when you lock that in by ear, then you're golden. When I'm doing a rel install, I like to use a few different types of music. And so I'll use something that's got a really heavy like bass line, which is generally between like 40 and 60 hertz is really where that is. So a lot of people don't realize how high in frequency deep bass is. And so a 40 hertz sound is probably what you're getting in most your pop music and stuff, because they're making that music to sound like it's got bass in a car. And most cars don't have subs. Modern cars have a little bit more bass than they used to, but at the same time they're wanting that to sound good in a car, and they're wanting it to sound good in your headphones and things like that. So that bass frequency is not 20 hertz. That bass frequency is generally like 40 to 60. So I'll play some hip hop type music that not necessarily hip hop, but something pop that's got like a nice bass line. And I will play some acoustic music where there's like nice strums of a guitar or a stand-up bass or something like that, and so it's more acoustically created or generated. And then I will play some classical music that's got big scale and big timpanis and like just bigger instruments and bigger presentation. And so I'll play those, and then I'll also generally play something that's very small. So a little, singer-songwriter or a small presentation type music where the sub, if it's booming, will be in the way. So that music, the subs create an air and an ambience to the sound, which is beautiful, but if you set it up incorrectly, it'll also create a presentation that isn't real. Like, you'll have that thump down there still when there shouldn't be a thump, So those are the different kind of things I go through with the music. Now, when setting phase with a rel, you've basically got a 0 or a 180 on the phase. So there's not a huge dial in there. And part of the reason why they don't give that huge dial is because most people don't, it overwhelms most people, and you're probably not going to get it perfect with that dial anyway. And it creates some confusion in the system and things like that. So they really only do a 0 or 180. But instead of doing the dial, we move the subwoofer. And so generally where I start, when I start setting up a rel, is I turn the gain up a little bit higher than I would generally like it. I turn the crossover up a little bit higher than I generally would like it. And I start with the sub about a foot behind the speaker. And generally, if you can, to the outside. If you can't, you can go to the inside, but it's generally preferable to the outside because that really helps expand that stage. So I start about a foot behind the speaker, and I start slowly inchworming the sub forward. And if you've got a buddy, that really helps because one of you can be dragging the sub and the other one can be sitting in the chair. And so I'll play something that's got a decently high bass note, something that I know for sure is in the main and is also in the sub. And so I'll start dragging the sub forward just a little, inch by inch, or even half an inch by half an inch kind of idea, and listening. And when you get to where that phase is really locked in, the sound of the sub and the sound of the main will come together. And you'll almost hear it kind of snap together, like it's locked. And so when you reach that point, you're there. I generally take note of where that spot is, and then I keep going. And so I'll put a little piece of tape down on the floor and say okay, here's our first lock-in phase point. And I'll keep coming forward, and then you might hear it again, or it might start sounding less and less and less, in phase. And so if you don't hear another lock-in point, then just go back to that first point. If you hear another one, then you can mark that one as well. And then you can kind of use other elements later to decide, which one you want to kind of stick with. But anyway, let's say now we have our phase locked in. So we'll go set the sub in that position and kind of lock it in. I also do toe in of the sub because, believe it or not, the toe in the sub towards you, it actually sounds tighter. So I will sit in the chair and we'll slowly start tuning it in. And as we toe in those subwoofers, the sound starts changing. And then it'll feel like you've gone too far, like the system just doesn't sound as big or whatever, and you can start kind of toeing back out. And then you can find the spot that kind of sounds best, where it's the tightest, it's most locked in, etc., etc. Then after we do that, we're going to go set gain and crossover. So I start with the crossover. So I generally turn the gain up a little too high, and then I start with the crossover all the way down, and I play music, and I start listening to the, as we slowly start creeping the crossover up. And when I say too high on the gain, I don't mean like crank it to max. I mean just audible, where you can tell that the sub is there and you're not blended in. You want it to be at least where the sub is. And so then I start coming up in my crossover until I hit a point where I feel like I have started getting into the range that the speaker's capable of. And then I start backing it back down. And so I come up until I hear that it's kind of getting into that territory of where the main is kind of at, and then I start coming back down. And then I generally will end up a couple notches below where I felt like it really started to kind of get into the speaker. At that point, I then turn the crossover. I note how many clicks it is, or on the number 31, I know what number it is. So let's say that I cross this over at 38 hertz. For these speakers go pretty low. They're $67,000 speakers. They should. And so I'm going to have a crossover probably in the, 38 or so, which is technically below where these are meant to be able to get to. But when you've got the room involved and et cetera, different elements of the sound, then there's a difference between producing those frequencies with power and authority and just producing those frequencies with a microphone. And so you generally will end up actually a little higher than what your speaker's specs say that they can get to. But anyway, going back to setting the gain. So I generally I note where I'm at, where I've decided that I like it, and then you come up in crossover so that you're back up. If I was going to cross over at 38, I'm going to come up to probably 45, right? And then I'm going to start coming up with my gain. And so I do the same thing. I play music and I slowly come up with the gain until I feel like that the sub is just audible. And as soon as the sub I feel like is audible, then I come back down a notch. And then I will come back down with the crossover where I've set it, and then I'll listen, right? And now we'll go through a couple different types of music and decide like, you know what, I'd like a little bit more punch in this type of music, so let's go up one notch in my gain. And then I'll go listen to the smaller ensembles, and then I'll be like, this is too much, so I'll maybe go back down. And then I'll come up with my crossover a little bit more just to make that other, with the pop music that I want a little bit more, I might be able to bring that gain back out of it a little bit by bringing the crossover up a little bit. So you can almost use gain and crossover in a yin-yang type format at that point. And so at that stage, you're kind of balancing things. So you're coming up with your crossover, down with your gain, you're coming up with your gain, down with your crossover. And only by like a couple notches here. We're not doing like 5 notches at this point. We're pretty dialed in at this point. So we're making minute changes to get it to where you like the sound for your preferences. And so you're basically doing that yin-yang approach where you're lowering and raising and raising and lowering until you kind of find where you like to be. At this point, if we're using 2 subs, we unplug this sub and we plug in the other one. And now we do the exact same thing with the other sub. So at this whole time, we've only been using 1 sub. So when we do the other sub, we're going to unplug this one now and do the other one. and we're going to dial it in the exact same way. Depending on your room acoustics and things like that, like in my room here, it's not the perfect room. I've got to crank up this sub by one notch, you know, so to make it sound balanced. And if I don't crank it up by one notch, then I have a little bit of an imbalance where I feel like there's a little more pressure coming from my right side than my left side in like mono recordings and things. And so I bring up this one just a touch, just to like balance that pressure and balance that sound a little bit. And that has to do with room acoustics, you know, and so that's just why you do them independently. So when you do the other sub, now you've got that one set, all right? Now you've listened to it, you've dialed it in, everything. Now plug in both subs. So now both are plugged in, both are where you've decided that you like it. Now you're possibly going to have to turn down your gain on both subs by one notch or so. Because now you've implemented two subs, and so your gain is going to come up just a touch, and or your output is going to come up a touch. I shouldn't necessarily say gain because, you know, that leads back to amplifier stuff, but your sound is going to pressurize a little bit more, and so there's a possibility that you're going to have to come down one notch on both subs. You know, so that's, you know, not optimal to have to like then readjust again, but at the same time it really helps to dial in one at a time because it really gets you locked in with each sub independently for the room. So anyway, at that point you're pretty much there and you're listening to music. So I hope that was a good explanation. I hope it helps you guys to be able to dial these in. If you're buying something like a Rel 31 or 32, and this is the 31, so this is actually the little brother to the bigger 32. But if you're buying something like that, I hope that you've worked with a dealer that's going to be coming out and installing it. But, you know, if you're not and you need this tutorial, that's great. I'm glad I could help you. And this same technique is good for all the Rel subs. So it doesn't matter if you're in the T series or, you know, the S series. The walkthrough that I just gave you should work with all of them. So anyway, that's everything about the Rel 31. I promised you guys that I'd make you a little video in our newsletter last month. And so anyway, that's the Rel 31. Thanks, guys. Signing out, Jeff with Reference Analog.